The sun was setting over the quiet suburban streets as Lieutenant Commander Wilson drove home from another long day at the naval base. His thoughts drifted to the dinner waiting at home and the stack of paperwork he had to tackle tomorrow. The familiar route had become almost automatic after years of service, his silver sedan blending in with the evening traffic. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror. Wilson checked his speedometer. He hadn't been speeding. With 20 years of military service under his belt, he knew exactly how to handle routine traffic stops. He pulled over carefully, positioning his car well off the road, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Officer Sullivan approached the driver's side window, his hand resting casually on his holster. Wilson rolled down his window, maintaining the calm composure that had earned him respect throughout his naval career. "Good evening, officer," he said politely, waiting for instructions before reaching for his documents. But something felt off from the start. Sullivan's tone dripped with unnecessary hostility as he demanded license and registration. Wilson moved slowly and deliberately, narrating his actions. "I'm reaching for my wallet now, sir." As he handed over his military ID and vehicle documents, he noticed Sullivan's expression shift from suspicion to something darker. "Step out of the vehicle," Sullivan barked, despite having no apparent cause. Wilson's military training kicked in. Stay calm, assess the situation, make smart decisions. He knew his rights, but he also knew that this moment could turn dangerous quickly. His fingers brushed against his phone in the center console, and he discreetly pressed record. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle?" Wilson's voice remained steady and professional, the same tone he used when dealing with difficult situations on base. Sullivan's response came with a sneer and a racial slur that had no place in modern law enforcement. The situation escalated rapidly. Other cars drove past slowly, their drivers watching the scene unfold. Wilson maintained his military bearing even as Sullivan unleashed a stream of racist comments, each one captured clearly on the phone's recording. When Sullivan unholstered his weapon, Wilson's combat training screamed at him to react, but he forced himself to remain still, hands visible, voice steady. "Sir, I'm a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy," Wilson stated calmly, though his heart raced. "I've served this country for 20 years. There's no need for weapons here." A couple had stopped on the sidewalk, phones raised, witnessing everything. Sullivan noticed them too, and his demeanor shifted slightly, though the weapon remained pointed at Wilson. Time seemed to stretch like rubber, each second lasting an eternity as Wilson's mind raced through his options. He thought about his family, his sailors who looked up to him, and every other person who had ever faced similar treatment. The decision crystallized in his mind. This wouldn't be another incident swept under the rug. This time, there would be consequences. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Sullivan lowered his weapon. He threw Wilson's documents back at him with a final racist remark and stormed back to his patrol car. As the police cruiser pulled away, Wilson remained parked, hands shaking slightly as he saved the recording and caught his breath. The couple from the sidewalk approached cautiously, offering to share their video and serve as witnesses. Wilson thanked them, his military training already kicking in as he mentally prepared his next steps. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever faced similar discrimination and stayed silent out of fear. Something needed to change, and perhaps this was the moment to make it happen. As he drove home in the gathering darkness, Wilson's mind was already formulating a plan. He had evidence, witnesses, and most importantly, the courage to stand up for what was right. Tomorrow would begin a new kind of battle, not one fought with weapons, but with truth, justice, and the determination to create lasting change. The kitchen clock ticked past midnight, but sleep felt impossible. Lieutenant Commander Wilson sat at his dining room table, staring at his phone where the recording of the traffic stop waited like a ticking time bomb. His wife sat across from him, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. You know what could happen if you take this forward, she said softly, concern etched across her face. We've seen how these things can go. She wasn't wrong. They both remembered the stories of others who'd spoken up, only to face harassment or worse. Their peaceful life in the suburbs, built carefully over 2 decades of service, could change overnight. Wilson got up and walked to the window, watching the quiet street where just hours ago he'd faced down the barrel of a police officer's weapon. The same streets where their kids rode their bikes and walked to school. His youngest had just started high school. How would this affect them? His phone buzzed. A message from one of his junior officers, asking for advice about a situation they'd faced in town. Young sailors often came to him with their problems, trusting his guidance. What message would he send if he stayed silent now? The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders, heavier than any military burden he carried. The next morning, exhausted from a sleepless night, Wilson walked into his office at the naval base. Everything looked the same. The stack of personnel reports, the family photo on his desk, the carefully arranged medals on the wall. But nothing felt the same. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Officer Sullivan's face twisted with hatred, heard those vile words that had no place in modern society. During the morning briefing, he watched his diverse team of sailors working together seamlessly. Young men and women from all backgrounds, united in service. One of them was giving a presentation about improved safety protocols, her hand steady as she pointed to charts and graphs. Wilson remembered her first day, nervous and uncertain. Now she stood tall, confident in her abilities. What would she think if she knew her commanding officer had faced discrimination and chosen to stay quiet? At lunch, he sat alone in his office, picking at his sandwich while researching similar cases on his computer. Some had led to real change. New policies, better training, officers held accountable. Others had disappeared into the bureaucratic maze, leaving victims more disillusioned than before. The couple who'd witnessed the incident had sent their video footage. Their message was simple. We'll support you if you decide to come forward. His phone rang, his eldest calling from college. They talked about classes and campus life, but Wilson could hear the worry in his child's voice. News of the incident had already spread through the family. "Dad," his child said before hanging up, "you always told us to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." Those words echoed in his mind as he drove home that evening, taking a different route to avoid passing the spot where it happened. He thought about every young sailor under his command who might face similar situations. He thought about his children growing up in a world where such behavior was allowed to continue unchecked. Walking into his house, Wilson found his wife had invited their closest friends over. People who'd stood by them through multiple deployments and life changes. They sat in the living room, offering not just support but practical advice. One worked in local government, another was a retired civil rights attorney. They didn't tell him what to do, but they made sure he understood he wouldn't have to do it alone. Later that night, Wilson sat at his desk, looking at a blank complaint form on his computer screen. His military training had taught him that true leadership meant making difficult decisions, especially when they were uncomfortable or risky. He thought about his oath, not just to the military, but to the principles of justice and equality that the uniform represented. His wife appeared in the doorway, holding 2 fresh cups of coffee. She didn't say anything, just placed one beside him and squeezed his shoulder. They both knew that once he started typing, their lives would change. But maybe, just maybe, other lives would change for the better too. The early morning sun streamed through the windows of Lieutenant Commander Wilson's home office as he spread documents across his desk. His phone recording played softly through the speakers. He'd listened to it so many times now that he could recite every word. But this wasn't about reliving the trauma. It was about building an airtight case. His friend from the civil rights organization had connected him with a lawyer who specialized in police accountability cases. Document everything, she'd advised during their first meeting. Every call, every email, every conversation. The smallest details matter. A fresh notebook sat open beside his laptop, its pages already filling with precise military-style notes. The dashcam footage request had initially been denied, but Wilson knew the system. 20 years in the Navy had taught him the power of proper channels and persistence. He filed appeals, made calls, and finally received support from a sympathetic clerk who helped process his request. When the footage arrived, it confirmed everything: the unwarranted aggression, the racial slurs, the drawn weapon. The couple who'd witnessed the incident kept in touch, sharing their video footage and agreeing to provide sworn statements. Their teenage daughter had also captured parts of the encounter on her phone from a different angle. Each piece of evidence added another layer of credibility to the case. Wilson's commanding officer called him into his office one afternoon. The older man leaned back in his chair, concern evident on his weathered face. "The police chief called," he said. "They're trying to handle this quietly." But instead of suggesting Wilson back down, his CO pulled out a folder. Inside was a detailed letter of support documenting Wilson's 2 decades of exemplary service. Back at home, Wilson's kitchen table had become a command center. His wife helped organize the growing stack of papers: witness statements, service records, commendations, and letters of support from fellow officers. Each document told part of a larger story about who he was and why his word could be trusted. The local NAACP chapter president visited one evening, bringing with her disturbing statistics about similar incidents in the area. "Most people stay quiet," she explained. "They're afraid, and who can blame them?" She helped Wilson understand how his case could create ripples of change beyond just one officer's actions. More stories began trickling in through various channels. A young store clerk described a similar encounter with Officer Sullivan. A college student shared cell phone footage of another aggressive traffic stop. An elderly gentleman sent a handwritten letter about his grandson's experience. Each story strengthened Wilson's resolve. His youngest asked one evening, "Dad, are you scared?" Wilson paused, choosing his words carefully. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," he explained. "It means you do what's right even when you are scared." They sat together, working on homework, the weight of the moment hanging silently between them. The formal complaint took shape slowly, meticulously. Each paragraph was carefully crafted, backed by evidence and witness statements. Wilson reviewed every word with his lawyer, making sure the document was professional and factual, just like the military reports he'd written throughout his career. Support came from unexpected places. A retired police sergeant reached out, offering insight into department procedures and previous complaints. A local church group organized a letter-writing campaign. Fellow naval officers shared their own experiences, creating a powerful narrative about the impact of unchecked discrimination. As Wilson prepared to submit the final complaint, his wife found him standing in front of their family photo wall. 20 years of memories hung there: promotions, graduations, family vacations. "Whatever happens," she said, squeezing his hand, "our children will know their father stood up for what's right." The next morning, Wilson walked into the police department's internal affairs office, a thick envelope under his arm containing the complaint and supporting documentation. The clerk at the desk barely looked up as she stamped the forms "Received." But Wilson knew this small administrative moment marked the beginning of something bigger. A challenge to the system that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked for too long. The Internal Affairs Office buzzed with unusual activity. Through the glass walls, investigators could be seen moving with purpose, their faces serious as they reviewed evidence. Lieutenant Commander Wilson's complaint had landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond that single traffic stop. A young investigator sat across from Wilson, her notebook open, asking detailed questions about that evening. She paused the dash cam footage at key moments, comparing it with Wilson's phone recording and the witnesses' videos. The timestamps matched perfectly, she noted, making careful marks in her file. Down in the police department's records room, Old complaints were being pulled from dusty files. Officer Sullivan's history began to emerge, painting a troubling picture. Previous incidents had been dismissed or buried, but they formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The investigator's desk filled with similar stories. Traffic stops gone wrong, unnecessary aggression, racist remarks. Local news vans appeared outside the police station. At first, the story was just a small segment on the evening news, but the body camera footage changed everything. When it was released through proper channels, social media exploded. People shared the video, adding their own stories of encounters with Officer Sullivan. Wilson's phone kept ringing with interview requests, but he maintained his professional composure. "I trust in the investigation process," he told reporters gathered outside the naval base. His quiet dignity in the face of growing media attention earned respect from both supporters and skeptics. Inside the police department, officers whispered in break rooms and hallways. Some defended Sullivan, claiming the pressure of the job could make anyone snap. Others, especially younger officers, saw this as a chance for necessary change. A veteran sergeant confided to investigators about warnings he'd given Sullivan years ago about his behavior. The police chief called an emergency meeting with city officials. Through the conference room windows, they could see peaceful protesters gathering in the square below. Signs demanded accountability and reform. The protesters included off-duty military personnel in civilian clothes, standing shoulder to shoulder with community members. Sullivan was placed on administrative leave, his badge and gun surrendered. He left the station through a back door, avoiding the media cameras. His police union representative made brief statements about due process and officer rights, but even these became more tentative as evidence mounted. At home, Wilson kept a growing file of supportive messages. Letters came from across the country. Other military personnel, police officers who wanted change, citizens sharing similar experiences. His kids helped sort through them, reading stories of courage and hope from people they'd never met. The investigation expanded beyond Sullivan. Internal Affairs discovered that several previous complaints had been improperly handled. Who had buried them? Why weren't they properly investigated? Each answer led to more questions, revealing cracks in the system that had allowed such behavior to continue. Wilson's commanding officer pulled him aside after a meeting. "The Secretary of the Navy called," he said quietly. "They're watching this case closely." What started as a local incident was becoming part of a larger conversation about accountability and justice. Community meetings were organized at local churches and community centers. People shared stories of their own encounters with law enforcement, both good and bad. Some officers attended, out of uniform, listening and learning. These conversations were difficult but necessary, building bridges between law enforcement and the community they served. One evening, as Wilson left the naval base, he noticed a young officer watching the latest news coverage on his phone. The screen showed protesters peacefully gathering, their signs calling for change. The young officer looked up, meeting Wilson's eyes, and nodded respectfully. No words were needed. They both understood that this moment could lead to real change. The investigation moved forward methodically, each piece of evidence carefully documented. Wilson knew this was just the beginning. Real change would take time, but for the first time in years, it felt possible. The truth was coming to light, and with it, the chance to build a better, more just system for everyone. The community center's parking lot overflowed on a warm Tuesday evening. Inside, people from all walks of life filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. Lieutenant Commander Wilson sat in the front row, watching as neighbors, fellow service members, and local residents stepped up to the microphone to share their stories. A retired Navy captain, his voice steady with decades of command experience, spoke about his own encounters with prejudice despite his rank. "What happened to the lieutenant commander isn't an isolated incident," he said. "It's a wake-up call we can't ignore." Other military personnel, both active and retired, nodded in agreement. Outside, Peaceful demonstrators gathered daily in front of the police station. They weren't angry mobs, but organized groups of citizens calling for change. Local teachers brought their students to observe democracy in action. Veterans groups showed up in support, their presence adding weight to the proceedings. The protesters kept things peaceful, picking up trash before they left each evening. The police union's initial defense of Officer Sullivan began to crumble as more evidence emerged. During a tense press conference, the union president shifted uncomfortably as reporters asked about previous complaints that had been dismissed. "We support good police work," he stated carefully. "But we cannot and will not defend actions that violate our oath to protect and serve." Local businesses put up signs supporting police reform. A coffee shop near the station offered free drinks to anyone who attended the community meetings on improving police-community relations. The owner, whose family had been in the neighborhood for 3 generations, said it was time for change. At the naval base, Wilson's case became a teaching moment. Young officers discussed professional conduct and moral courage during their training sessions. "It's not just about following orders," an instructor explained. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult." The local high school invited Wilson to speak at an assembly about civic responsibility. Looking out at the young faces, he kept his message simple. Change starts with each of us choosing to do the right thing. The students listened intently, many of them having seen the viral videos of his encounter. A group of police officers, including several veterans, formed an unofficial committee to review department policies. They met after hours, volunteering their time to draft recommendations for better training and accountability. Their dedication showed that many within law enforcement wanted positive change. Church groups and community organizations held forums to discuss building trust between police and citizens. These weren't just talking sessions. They produced real action plans. Volunteers organized ride-along programs, youth outreach initiatives, and community policing workshops. The city council chambers were packed during special sessions on police reform. Residents waited hours to speak, sharing personal experiences and suggestions for improvement. The council members, faced with their constituents' powerful testimonies, began drafting new oversight policies. Local media covered the story with increasing depth, moving beyond sensational headlines to examine systemic issues. A respected newspaper reporter spent weeks investigating similar incidents in neighboring communities, showing that the problem extended beyond just one officer or department. Wilson's wife organized a support group for families affected by discrimination in law enforcement encounters. They met in living rooms and community centers, sharing stories and resources, turning pain into purpose. The group quickly grew, drawing participants from across the region. One evening, a young police recruit approached Wilson after a community meeting. "Your story made me think hard about why I wanted to become an officer," the recruit said. "I want to be part of the solution." These quiet moments of connection showed how one person's courage could inspire others to reflect and act. As the sun set over another day of peaceful demonstrations, Wilson stood with his family, watching community members from all backgrounds talking together, sharing ideas, and working toward change. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but the energy and determination in the air gave hope that real transformation was possible. The City Hall hearing room felt smaller than usual, packed with people watching the disciplinary proceedings unfold. Lieutenant Commander Wilson sat straight-backed in his naval uniform, his calm presence a stark contrast to the tension in the air. The Civilian Review Board members sat behind a long table, their expressions serious as they reviewed the evidence. The department's internal affairs investigator presented her findings first. Her voice was clear and professional as she walked through the timeline, playing audio and video recordings that left no room for doubt. The dash cam footage played on large screens, showing the escalation of that night from routine stop to dangerous confrontation. A young officer stepped forward to testify. His hands trembled slightly as he described working with Officer Sullivan. He often made comments, racist comments, the officer said, his voice growing stronger. I regret not speaking up sooner. Others followed. Fellow officers breaking the traditional blue wall of silence to share what they'd witnessed over the years. The police union lawyer tried to paint Sullivan's actions as a single mistake in an otherwise acceptable career. But the evidence told a different story. Previous complaints emerged from the department's records, incidents that had been downplayed or dismissed. The pattern was clear and undeniable. During a break, Wilson stepped into the hallway for water. A retired police surgeon approached him, speaking quietly. 25 years on the force, the surgeon said, and I've seen too many good officers stay quiet about the bad ones. Thank you for speaking up. These small moments of support meant as much as the official proceedings. Sullivan's testimony came next. He shifted in his seat, his former confidence replaced by defensive anger. His explanations rang hollow against the clear evidence. When questioned about his body camera footage, he had no explanation for his actions or his words. The review board members exchanged glances as his testimony unraveled. Wilson's testimony was different. He spoke with the measured tone of a military officer, describing events exactly as they happened. His military records backed his credibility. 20 years of exemplary service, commendations for leadership, and a reputation for honesty. The board members leaned forward, engaged by his direct answers and clear recollection. Community members filled the public comment period. A high school teacher described how Sullivan had terrorized her teenage son during a traffic stop. A business owner shared security camera footage of Sullivan's aggressive behavior toward elderly customers. Each story added weight to the case. The police chief sat through it all, his face growing more troubled with each testimony. He'd inherited a department with deep-rooted problems, but now he had a chance to address them. His own testimony acknowledged the need for change, promising specific reforms beyond this single case. As the board deliberated, the crowd in the hallway grew. News cameras waited outside, but inside, people spoke in hushed tones about hope for real change. A young rookie officer told Wilson that the case had inspired a group of newer officers to start meeting regularly, discussing how to build better community relations. The board's decision, when it came, was unanimous. Sullivan's termination was immediate and permanent. But they went further, recommending a complete review of his past arrests and citations. The chief announced additional measures: mandatory bias training, stronger accountability procedures, and a new civilian oversight committee. Wilson's wife squeezed his hand as they listened to the verdict. Their children would know their father had stood up for what was right, and that justice was possible when people refused to look away from wrongdoing. The system could work when enough people demanded better. Outside the hearing room, reporters asked Wilson for his reaction. He spoke about moving forward, about building trust between law enforcement and the community. This isn't about one officer, he said. It's about making sure everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are or what they look like. As the sun set over City Hall, people lingered, talking about what would come next. This ending was really a beginning, the start of real changes in how the department operated. Wilson's stand had opened the door, but it would take everyone's continued effort to make lasting change possible. 6 months after the hearing, Lieutenant Commander Wilson stood at the podium in the Police Academy's main lecture hall. Fresh-faced recruits filled the seats, their notebooks open, ready to learn from his experience. His story had become a mandatory part of their training, not just what happened that night, but how one person's courage to speak up could create lasting change. The police department looked different now. New faces in leadership positions brought fresh perspectives. The Civilian Oversight Committee met regularly, their meetings open to the public and well attended. Body camera footage was reviewed monthly, not just when complaints were filed. Officers received ongoing training in bias awareness and community relations. In the break room at the Naval base, Wilson noticed younger officers speaking more openly about their experiences. They shared stories that once would have been kept quiet, knowing they had support from leadership. A junior officer recently thanked him. explaining how his example had given her the courage to report discrimination she'd faced off base. The changes spread beyond just one department. Neighboring cities sent representatives to learn about the new oversight programs and training procedures. Wilson's case became a teaching tool in police academies across the state. Training manuals were rewritten to include stronger sections on bias awareness and professional conduct. Community meetings continued, but their tone had shifted. Instead of anger and frustration, people shared stories of positive changes they'd noticed. A grandmother spoke about how a young officer had helped her grandson with homework. A shop owner described police officers walking their beats, stopping to chat with locals and learn their names. Wilson's children noticed the difference too. His youngest came home excited one day, telling how a police officer had visited their school. Instead of just talking about safety, the officer had opened up about his own learning journey, about understanding different perspectives and serving all community members equally. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story, tracking the changes 6 months after Sullivan's firing. Crime rates hadn't risen as some had feared. Instead, community cooperation with law enforcement had improved. People felt more comfortable reporting problems, knowing they would be taken seriously. At a national law enforcement conference, Wilson shared the podium with reform-minded police chiefs from across the country. They discussed practical steps for building trust between officers and communities. His military background added weight to his words about leadership, accountability, and the courage to stand up for what's right. The support group Wilson's wife had started continued to grow. They'd moved from sharing stories of pain to working on solutions, partnering with police training programs to share community perspectives. Their input helped shape new department policies on everything from traffic stops to community engagement. One evening, Wilson received a letter from a police recruit in another state. The young officer had read about his case and decided to become an officer specifically to be part of the positive changes happening in law enforcement. These messages reminded him that the ripples of one person's actions could reach far beyond their own community. The Civilian Review Board's work had expanded. They didn't just handle complaints. They recognized officers who showed exceptional community service. Good officers felt supported in doing the right thing, while those who couldn't adapt to the higher standards chose to leave. Wilson's commanding officer called him in one morning. The Navy was developing new training materials about moral courage and standing up against discrimination. They wanted to include his story. "Your experience is helping us build a better future," the commander said, not just for the police, but for all public servants. As Wilson drove home that evening, he passed the spot where it all began. The street looked the same, but everything else had changed. A police car pulled up at the stop sign, and the officer waved. A simple gesture that meant so much more now. The relationship between police and community was healing, one interaction at a time. At dinner that night, Wilson listened to his family talk about their day. His kids spoke about future careers in public service without fear or hesitation. The change he'd helped start would continue through them and others like them, building a future where everyone could expect to be treated with dignity and respect.